Hello, welcome back to The Sensitivity Doctor. This is Dr. Amelia Kelley, and today I have an episode for those of you trying to figure out whether or not it's time to cut ties with your toxic parents. I sit down with Dr. Sharon Martin, who is an amazing author and therapist and also fellow HSP, highly sensitive, who really cares about helping you become empowered and find your voice when you're trying to cut ties and get out of relationships that don't work for you. You can also find out more about her work on Psychology Today in her popular blog called Conquering Codependency. And she also has a handful of amazing books out called The Better Boundaries Workbook and the one we talk about today, Cutting Ties with Your Parents. So follow us as we take you through making the decision, figuring out how to continue having self-compassion, figuring out how to deal with the expectations of others and cultural expectations, and then finally, how to find your new network of support, find yourself through your shame, and also deal with the grief and loss of ending these relationships. There's a lot to unpack here, so take notes, share the episode, review the episode so others who need it can find it, and enjoy. So excited to talk to you because I feel like so many of my clients that I work with struggle with literally what you wrote your book about. I mean, probably half of the clients I see, honestly. And actually just the client I was just working with, her father just died and her mother, who she had cut ties with, came out of the woodwork to apologize and say, I'm so sorry. I need to see you. Life is too short. And so I was talking with that client just before meeting with you and mentioned that I was going to be meeting with you and mentioned your book to her. And she jokingly goes, great, bring me up as a case study.
We got to solve all our problems. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And that's also partly why I wrote the book, is having so many of my own clients who just
Right.
struggled and struggled before getting to the point of realizing that it was okay to end the relationship, or actually taking some steps that would stick.
Right.
Often a lot of false starts. But yeah, just it being such an agonizing decision for people,
Yeah.
and often for those of us on the outside, frankly, going, yes, this is obviously really toxic, but,
Yes,
right,
totally.
they're not able to see it.
So you were saying that you noticed just in your own work that a lot of people, I love how you just said, do it and stick with it. What do you mean by that?
Well,
That's interesting.
there's a lot of false starts, and I don't mean that to say that cutting off all contact is necessarily the goal for everybody. It's very individualized, and people need to find their own path and what's going to work for them. But what often happens is they'll put some distance there. Again, that might be cutting off all contact for a period of days or weeks or months, sometimes even years. And then something will happen that initiates making contact again. Again, that might be something that's on the adult child's side of things, or it could be something that happens from another family member or a parent, that they end up back in connection. And then oftentimes what happens is things might go along okay for a short period of time, and then they recognize that nothing significant has changed, that the same relationship problems that had caused them to put that distance there in the first place still exist. And then they again, will make some intentional effort to put some distance there, step away from the relationship. And this, sort of on again, off again relationship, again, can take many forms over long periods of time. And then for some people, they do get to a point where they say, absolutely, no contact is really the only way to preserve my well being. And that's what happens for them. And then again, there are other people that I think just, sort of muddle through various amounts of contact over long periods of time. And, it's constantly in flux for them.
So you said various forms of contact. What would you say are I don't know, could you categorize them into the different types of contact someone would have? And I say this because that client I was talking with you about, that actually it makes sense what you're saying, because she had no contact, I think, for 4 years. And then, her father passing, and this catalyzed her mom reaching back out. So it's kind of like those big life events.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when she was talking about it, I had always been under the impression she had no contact with her mother. But then it turned out that, well, they did exchange cards and the occasional text for birthdays. And so I guess they don't have no contact. So how would you
Right.
categorize it? It can get a little confusing.
It can, and I think that's part of what's challenging is we're using sometimes the same language, the same terms, but we don't necessarily mean the same things, right? So sometimes people use terms like low contact or no contact or a full estrangement. But again, what does that really mean for any particular
Right,
person? We probably really need to ask them because that definition can vary from one person to the next. And something like low contact is so vague that what you're describing with this person might be considered low contact because technically they're having some contact uh,
right,
with this person, but not a lot. But for somebody else, they might be saying, well, this is really, so little contact that I feel like it's no
right,
contact when, right, we're not exactly talking
right.
about the same things. But yeah, for
Well,
some people, it's like they have set up particular forms of contact or amounts of contacts or situations in which they will have contact. It could be something where, you only see your family for the holidays, or you only text, or you only have a birthday card. And there's, again, very specific things that are sort of acceptable or things that you will tolerate. And the rest of it, you have decided doesn't work for you to try to put some
yeah.
boundaries around it.
I can relate to that in the sense I can think of a particular family member of mine who the conversations, even on the phone, are just, they're distressing. They're not really healthy or worth it. And so I'm one of the only ones who's still in contact with this person. So many people in the family have estranged from this individual, but I've realized that what feels good to me is sending cards. Like it feels good. It fulfills like an aspect of the amount of care I feel comfortable and safe giving. But phone conversations don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe or healthy. Whether or not they want it, it doesn't matter to me. It's more I'm like kind of connecting with what I feel physically and internally. And so I feel like we almost launch straight into where someone who already has made a decision would be. So if I could bring us back to the beginning a little bit for someone who's listening and thinking, okay, great ladies, but how do I get started? Let's say someone's listening and they either haven't made any of these decisions yet or they've been kind of sucked back in, as you were saying. What are some of the signs that, like, what you're experiencing is not just the aches and pains of a relationship in a family that we all encounter, and that maybe what you're experiencing truly is toxic and should be looked at further?
Right. I mean, that's a great place for us to begin, I think, is thinking about what are some of the signs that this relationship has maybe crossed over from difficult, afflicted to something that we might define as truly toxic, abusive, dysfunctional. And again, I mean, those are all somewhat big terms as well. So we'll do our best to try to
Right.
define what some of that means. I think one piece that we don't want to overlook here is that there is a pattern of mistreatment. So we're not talking about situations where this is just a one off. We've had a really bad argument or a falling out over this one particular thing. This is really a situation where there have been relationship problems that have persisted over a long period of time. I would say for most people, they look back and say this began early on in childhood, that this was an unhealthy relationship between parent and child, that the child was mistreated as a child, and that has continued into adulthood. Although the particular type or the way that looks, or even maybe the way it feels in adulthood might be different. Again, it is continual so that this isn't something that, oh, I had a great childhood, everything was fine. And then now as an adult, my mother, my father, and I are not getting along. That's not typically what I see for people who are in this situation. So there might be an event that is sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will. This is the last straw of the relationship. But again, if we really look back, we can see that there's been a pattern of things that have not been going right. So this might include things like verbal abuse, constant criticism, name calling, yelling, controlling, demanding behaviors. Certainly physical abuse is something that happens more often than a lot of people recognize, even amongst adult children and their parents. Also things like emotional manipulation, gaslighting, blame shifting. Again, a lot of those manipulative guilt trip kinds of behaviors are often part of these relationships. And then the other thing that I think we want to remember here is that typically there is an effort to address the relationship problems, but has not been able to, the problems have not been able to be solved despite, your best efforts. You've tried multiple times. And again, I think one of the common misconceptions is that people are ending relationships without having really tried very hard to try to solve the problems. Like they haven't
Right.
talked about it, they haven't set boundaries. When in fact, what I see amongst my clients is the exact opposite. If people have tried and tried and tried really long past the point in which I would have said was sort of a reasonable expectation, they have, that the relationship is important to them. So it's not as if they don't care. In fact, I think they care very deeply. And like I said, they have worked really hard at trying to address the issues. But what often happens is the other person either will not take responsibility or acknowledge the harm that they have caused. So there can't be the repair work that needs to happen for the relationship to move forward. Behavior is not changed. So again, that hurtful behavior tends to just continue on and on. There's no apology. There's no ability for the relationship to change, to move in a healthy direction. So that's the other important piece of it again, because oftentimes we can have relationships that are actually pretty dysfunctional. But if there's the ability for both parties to do that repair work and do the behavior change that is necessary, a lot of the relationships can be saved. But obviously, if we're stuck in this pattern and we can't get out of it, that's where we're really looking at the decision of, okay, well, what else can I do? If I feel like I've tried everything else to make the relationship healthier and more functional, and it
Right.
just has not happened, then again, I'm sort of at this crossroads of, okay, I think my only option, again, really for my own well-being, is to create some distance there.
Right. I like that you brought up patterns. That's actually something that I get asked a lot about. How do you know the difference between gaslighting versus just typical conflict or typical misremembering? And I usually remind folks who are looking for that is the pattern, and is there a repeated experience and erosion of a sense of self and agency. And I think one thing that I didn't exactly hear you say specifically, but I could see it being a byproduct of everything you were saying, is that after a repeated amount of all of this happening, your sense of self will be impacted and your sense of independence. And especially when we're thinking someone who is an adult who should have the ability to have their own independent choices. It's interesting. I think of a client of mine who also was very excited I was speaking to you, who has struggled because there are certain areas of her life where she really still seeks the approval and the guidance of her parents, but in the contrast, we've been working so hard on her making her own choices and not, needing that from them and trusting herself. So I can see, knowing where you look at the ability to say, this relationship is not working for me, whether it be your parents or whether it be, I work on a lot with people ending romantic relationships that are unhealthy, trusting that what you feel like is the right next choice is the right next choice, especially when the very person you're deciding to cut ties with or maybe estrange from or maybe, reduce impact that relationship with has done such a masterful job eroding your inner dialogue and eroding your trust with yourself. So, how can someone know, okay, I hear you. I know that this is probably a toxic relationship that I need to either reduce or cut off. How can they connect and really know and trust themselves that that's the right choice? And I will say this with a comma and a caveat. I read your book and I loved that so many of your journal exercises, I think, really focused on this question.
Good.
Yeah, they really
Well,
did. It was excellent.
because this is where we get stuck, is the guilt and the shame and the societal pressure are so intense. In addition to what you were talking about, is that folks who have grown up in abusive or dysfunctional families have already been conditioned not to trust themselves and their own judgment. And they have experienced that abusive relationships are normal. It makes it very difficult for them to then recognize that, yes, both I have needs and those needs are valid. And they're in conflict with what my family wants me to do, or what my community or society at large wants me to do. And so we really have to do a lot of unraveling of those messages that we have gotten that it is wrong or bad or selfish for us to do something like step away from the relationship with our family because it is in our own best interest. But, as you're pointing out, if we don't do this piece of work, we're going to, I think, either stay in the relationships that are unhealthy for us, that are hurting us, or we're going to get stuck in that pattern that we were talking about earlier, which is it's just on again, off again. I'm, sort of
Right.
going round and round in this relationship, but I can't really free myself in a meaningful way that would allow me to do the healing work, the trauma recovery work that would really be impactful and help me live a healthier, happier life. So that's why we need to, do this piece of really digging into what does a healthy relationship mean for me? Or what does an unhealthy or abusive relationship look like? You know, and you and I can, list off all of the signs and symptoms of abusive relationships. But at the end of the day, I think that has some value, but we're not the arbitrators of other people's decisions of what
Right.
they want to tolerate in their lives or what kind of relationships they want to have. Right. So that's really something that people need to decide for themselves. Where is that line? And it's not as easy as it might seem. Again, it seems like I should just be able to, go through the checklist and say, yes, 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 my relationship is having all these signs. It's abusive according to this quiz or this checklist. But if I don't actually believe it, how is that helping me? Right? I have to, right for
Yes.
myself figure out. And that is, like you were saying, there's a lot of reflection that needs to happen in order for us to come to that decision. And I think there has to be a lot of self-compassion that's part of this because it's very easy to fall into self-blame. Again, because that's something that's so instilled in us. We want to be able to move into a place where I can, be gentler with myself, that I can, recognize and acknowledge that this is hard, that this is painful, that this shouldn't be a rash decision. It's not something that anybody is just making the decision to cut ties with their parents or a family member and moving on the next day. Again, I think these are maybe some of the, misconceptions that people have that people who are cutting ties are sort of heartless and they're just, see you later and they don't have any feelings about it. But people have a lot of really painful feelings, even when they're the one who is doing the distancing, right? They're the one who is initiating that
Right.
space. It still tends to be a really, really painful experience for people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
I like that you were bringing up the kind of the cognitive dissonance or that confusion, that inner emotional confusion with having something so black or white as a checklist in front of you. I know with a lot of my clients, we'll use the power of control wheel, which is a common model. And we all know, for anyone that uses it, in that wheel, if you even have one slice of the pie that applies to your relationship, it's potentially abusive. And it feels to me sometimes the label of being, quote, abusive is not even necessarily the thing that catalyzes someone finally ending something. There sometimes almost needs to be something, it feels like, outside of the relationship that does that, whether it be the relationship is impacting another healthy relationship, or the relationship is impacting my children, or it's impacting my ability to get my work, or my ability to make a love connection. I've seen, I don't know if this is something you've seen, where I wish it could be you, the listener, you, the person, are enough. Like, just you being treated well is enough of a reason to leave a relationship. But because of what we're talking about, how that inner, like, I guess the esteem, the self esteem that you deserve to be treated with love and respect just because you exist, right? Because it's so eroded, sometimes it has to be the secondary reason of why someone leaves and is willing to. But as you were talking, there was something that came to my mind that I wanted to ask you about with regard to our perception of the person who cuts ties. How you were saying they're heartless, or they just, they're so black or white, or they're just so aggressive that they could do this. I can't believe you're not calling your mother on Mother's Day, or whatever it is. How does someone navigate if you are, okay, I'm trying to think of a way to put this where I'm just gonna get a little personal. So I think about people in my husband's family who have chosen not to be in contact anymore. That's the most I'll say. I won't go any further into that. But what I have noticed is there's this kind of secondary fallout that can happen, where if you are cutting ties with this person, it then impacts this other potentially healthy relationship because maybe you're still in contact. There's just such a messy ripple effect that happens. And I'm wondering how two different people can navigate this, both the person who's part of the ripple and then the person that wants to make the initial cut, but they're worried about that ripple effect. This seems so hard to me.
It is, and it's really common. So again, I think it's helpful for people to know that if they have had this experience of cutting ties with one particular person, and then they find that other relationships either either people are angry with them within the family, or other people have cut ties with them as well. And part of this is that, like you were saying, I mean, there's sort of this thing that happens where people just sort of end up feeling like they need to take a side. It's almost as if, and again, this is often something that happens with people that have sort of narcissistic or these toxic personality traits, is they
Yes.
want to be in control. They want to control the narrative. So this abusive or narcissistic person, when somebody has cut ties with them, then they will then go and sort of do the smear campaign, or they're doing this gossiping, and they're really bad mouthing the person who has cut ties with them, trying to shift that narrative so that they are the victim instead of the abuser.
Yep.
And because they often do hold a lot of sway and a lot of power within the family, they will most likely get at least some of the family members to take their side. So, and then they will strong arm them into cutting off of the relationship with the person who cut off the relationship with them. Sorry, it's very
We're going to make a flow chart.
yeah, you need a flow chart, and I need some better terms for who's who in this dynamic. But yes, it's often a lot about power and control and who has it in the family. And so people will feel like they need to take a side in this, and they will tend to side with the aggressor because that person has the power, and they have the power to hurt them as well. So so I think once we recognize that unfortunately this is a reality, you may or may not be able to try to reestablish those relationships with those sort of secondary family members who have stepped away from you. Again, I mean, the relationship dynamics just may be such that it's not possible,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But what we're left with then, unfortunately, is a really sparse support system, right? Most of us rely on our family for emotional support, practical support. And I will say, unfortunately, a lot of people don't get the support that they need from their friends either, which, seems really, really unfortunate because, these are people that we have chosen to have in our life that we thought were going to be supportive and be there for us. But, again, as I had said, there is really just a lot of stigma around family estrangement and especially about being the person who is cutting ties with family members that I think as a society, we have a lot of denial about the level of abuse and harm that happens in families. And it just seems like a lot of people just don't want to believe that it has been as abusive or painful or harmful to people as it has. And if you don't understand that piece, then of course it doesn't make sense. Why are you not going to forgive your parents, or why are you not going to see them for Christmas, or whatever the scenario is? People who have functional relationships with their families certainly are going to have a hard time understanding those dysfunctional dynamics and just, again, how entrenched they are and how devastating it is for people. So, anyway, it can leave people in a really, really difficult situation in terms of not having the support system that they
Right.
need and that would really be instrumental in their healing. So, I don't want this to sound like, "Oh my gosh, there's no
The
solution
end.
for this." Right,
Yeah.
there is. I mean, it's just it takes work because we need to specifically seek out and work towards having relationships with people who really do
Right.
understand what you're going through. So really specific kinds of peer support or professional support can be really helpful, especially in the beginning for people to try to cope with what they're going through. And then a lot of people will develop over time, what they call a chosen family. Those are really close relationships, really special friends, really committed relationships that are like family for them.
Right.
But of course, that doesn't happen overnight. It's something that we really need to put a lot of effort into. But that can bridge that gap and really be impactful and really healing for people as well.
Have you ever heard of the circles of support model or the circles of support framework?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
So I just published an article in Psychology Today about this yesterday because I loved it so much when I came across it in a book I was reading by Jessica McCabe on how to ADHD. So it was
Mm.
centered around people who are neurodiverse or developmentally have different issues going on, and they're not necessarily feeling really confident in their relationship building. But as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this could totally apply to people who have had to cut ties and then are trying to create a network and a support group. So basically, to just break it down really quickly, you've got four circles of support. The first circle is kind of like the most inner, and that's going to be your circle of intimacy. And those are people that you love, that you share your vulnerabilities with. The second circle, which I found interesting, is then the circle of friendship. So I thought that was interesting that that was different. The circle of friendship is folks who you go to coffee with or you see at birthday parties, you make fun memories with, but you may not necessarily be divulging your inner demons to. And then circle number three is circle of participation. So this is going to be where you put yourself, and I could see folks who have recently cut ties really needing this circle, where you put yourself out into the world doing things that you like, that you're interested in, to connect with others. Now, here's two really cool things about that circle. The first thing is that if you think about things you like about yourself, so let's say I like that I'm curious and I like that I have a good sense of humor. I'm just picking things. Or I like that I'm also active. If I go and choose activities that are humorous, I mean, I don't really want to be a stand up comedian, but humorous, active, and curious. So if I put myself in a hiking club, for instance, I'm going to be doing things that shine on the things I like the most about myself. So you're feeling your best in the circle of participation. And then there's a lot of research on like I think it's called like mirror appeal or something. When you're around something enough, you start to find it appealing. That if we trust that enough time in the circle of participation happens, you can eventually transition to circle two and circle one, which is, I think people cutting off ties are craving circle one because that's kind of what they're pulling out. And then finally, the last circle I think is important to notice is circle four, which is the circle of exchange. And that's going to be individuals who you literally pay, usually, for a service, but they can still be really close relationships. So your therapist, your barista, your hairdresser, you can have really good rapport and connection, and they fulfill a need for you, but there is that level of exchange. And one thing that was really interesting about this model is that folks who either have neurodiversity, developmental issues, or maybe traumas, complex trauma, tend to have the majority of their relationships in circle one and circle four. But the ideal is to have a bit of a balance between all four circles. And it makes sense because to maintain friendships takes a lot of work. So I just wanted to throw that out there, thinking that maybe for someone listening who is worried about following through with cutting these ties because they're listening to you and thinking, it really would be a good idea. Maybe if you give this a try and say, I'm going to lean into circle three, trust that if I spend time there long enough, these other ones will get full. I don't know. Maybe it's a neat coping skill they could try.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in there that you brought up that probably could be its own podcast episode for sure. But yes, I think if we think about this in terms of we need to have different types of relationships
Right.
in our lives, and not all of our relationships need to be in the intimate circle.
Right.
Right, because again, I think that feels really appealing, but to recognize that there's benefits in having friends and people that we just
Yes.
do activities with as well, that
Right.
those
You're not putting so
all
much
play a
pressure on
part.
circle one all the time.
Right, right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's important too, and I think maybe we're not putting as much pressure on ourselves to force every relationship to be in circle one either. That, we can just let somebody be in the friend category or in the participation category and recognize that that adds something of value to our life as well.
Absolutely.
And as you said, I
So,
mean, sometimes people are going to move into a more intimate category, but not always, and that's okay too.
right. So I'm curious if you if someone listening is thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop either communicating, seeking approval, being too intertwined, or I'm going to set measured contact. Like I was saying, sending that family member those cards and, having a relationship, but not necessarily anything too deep. So they've made the decision. They're hearing you that they need to lean into something I loved from your book was that just because you cut it doesn't mean it's ever going to feel necessarily good. Yeah. So, how would you support someone or guide someone to work through, I think, the two biggest emotions, shame and or like this guilt feeling, but then also the grief over maybe the relationship that they wish they could have had that hasn't transpired. So those are two big questions. I don't know which one you want to start with.
Oh, well, let's start with the shame and the guilt. Yes, but don't let me forget to come back to
I
the
promise
grief
I
because
won't.
I will get off on a tangent very easily. But I think we had touched a little bit on this earlier, but recognizing that, you know, everybody is going to feel some amount of shame and guilt. I think that is baked into the way we are socialized to have, like I said, some amount of that when you are doing something that's really going against the grain,
Being
in
a
most people's
trendsetter and
mind.
a revolutionary
Right.
by cutting ties.
Right. Right. I mean, and as sort of sad and strange as that sounds, I mean,
It
because we're
is.
really talking about something that we're doing for our own well-being to look out for ourselves. shouldn't have to be this radical idea, and
Right.
yet it certainly is for a lot of people going against what society tells us we're supposed to be doing. So some of that is trying to explore that and really deciding for yourself what is behavior, like, is this a choice that makes sense for you? Do you truly believe that you are doing something wrong or bad by cutting ties? And again, we're trying to, differentiate what do other people think, their judgment, their morality, and your own. And I really like people to really tune into their own beliefs and values about this because again, it very easily gets wrapped up in what other people are telling us. This messaging that we're
True.
getting from so many different sources that we don't even realize, we're getting it all of the time. So we really need to be able to say, okay, what do I believe? Do I believe that this is something that is a wrong thing to do? And one way that we can do this is trying to step out of this situation instead of thinking about it as yourself, but look at it as you're an observer and think about if somebody else was having this exact same experience. This was your child or your best friend, and they were having this exact relationship with their parents, and they had done all the things that you have done. Would you be thinking that they were, making a bad decision or that they were being selfish? And sometimes just looking at it from a different perspective can be really helpful because for whatever reason, it seems to be easier for us to say, of course not. If,
Right.
my adult child was having this problem, I would of course understand that they didn't want to continue to have that relationship. I would be supportive of them doing whatever they needed to do for their own well-being. And so that can just help us shift that and go, okay, this isn't a situation that I need to feel bad about. I don't need to be ashamed of. But of course, I'm doing that messaging. It's a process. It's not going to be a switch that we're
Right.
going to, one day just wake up and say, of course, I don't feel guilty about it. It's really going to be, taking some baby steps. I feel a little bit less guilty about it, a little less ashamed. I'm talking about it a little bit more. Again, finding people who are going to be supportive, and that's, talking to them is going to help me not feel as ashamed because I'm getting some validation from other people. But I also need to be able to give myself that validation. And that's the most important piece
Yes.
of it is saying, you know what, I know that this is okay for me to do. Even if other people disagree, they're entitled to their opinion
Right.
and I'm entitled and I deserve to do the things that are going to support my well-being.
I love how you were saying the importance of kind of getting that mirroring back of that this decision makes sense because there are like-minded people who see where I'm coming from with this. I'm curious because I have some clients who they know through and through it's the right decision, but culturally, whether it have to do with like their ethnic culture, their all different cultures, but that's the one thing I know, religious culture, the different reasons where I see the culture that they're in doesn't necessarily support them cutting it. So when we think of like society, it's kind of like the idea of, oh, of course you're going to work things out with your family, which actually I'm loving that there's a little bit of a different dialogue about that lately. I think as we're all bringing focus on what generational trauma is and how it affects our bodies and our genetics and I'm hoping this is a generation where we're normalizing this a whole lot more. How would you guide or help someone who they feel like culturally, whether it be religion or their family of origins culture, tells them otherwise? And not to put you on the spot because I hate when people do this to me when I'm on podcasts, but I'm going to do it to you. Do you know any like groups or websites or like a specific podcast where there's other people who are doing this, who are cutting ties, where they're all kind of coming together? I hate when people do that to me when I'm on a podcast and they say, "What's a website?" But I am asking if you know of any.
Yes. Well, to my knowledge, and I think I'm up to date, is that we shockingly in the United States have only one nonprofit organization that is specifically dedicated to supporting adults who are cutting ties with families, and it's called
Really?
Together Estranged. It's a
Okay.
fairly small
I'm writing that
organization,
down
but
because I've
but
never heard of
but they
it.
do have some online support groups and a newsletter and information on their website, and they have some live Q&A and informational things that they do. So
Ha-
anyway,
And
that's the best resource that I'm aware of in terms of getting support and support groups. There may be things local for people as well. And again, the other thing is, if we want more, people have to start it, right? So grassroots is what needs to happen. Is if you're looking for a peer support group in your area and you can't find it, see if you can, find some other people and get something going. The other thing is we can find some support that's related, that's maybe not exactly, what we're looking for, but there might be something that's on a topic that's a little bit more broad that can still be supportive for people. Even some of the
yeah.
12-step programs, right? Adult children, 12-step
Yeah, maybe
programs
like
can be
Al
great.
Anon or Coda. Have you
Yeah.
heard of, I'm going to give a shout out to Andrea Ashley and her
Mhm.
podcast, Adult Child Pod. Have you heard of
Yeah.
her?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I love
Absolutely.
her.
Yeah.
I think her support group, I want to say it's called The Shit Show. So now I'm going to have to put a something for mature audiences on this episode for saying that, but I think that group is really similar too. Like I think it's for a lot of folks who are cutting ties or realizing that the relationships that were their formative relationships are no longer healthy for them. So
Yeah, that
that might be an idea
podcast
too.
is a great resource. I'm not really familiar with what she's doing in terms of support group
Yeah.
stuff, but
No,
yeah,
she's great.
podcast is awesome. Yeah,
Awesome.
really,
Yeah.
really
Totally agree.
raw and real and
Yep. Yeah, she's
the
great.
real deal.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to talk about grief?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and one
Okay.
other thing, do you think
Yeah.
there's anything specific as far as the culture piece goes?
Mm,
Because, I mean, I will say I'm
yes.
in the Raleigh Durham area and we have a very strong Southeast Asian culture here and culture of folks from India. And a lot of our clients at my practice are from this area of the world. And I know there's a very strong collective culture within that culture. And so
Yep.
folks that I've worked with who are trying to cut ties with family have a lot of backlash from family members in the process of trying to do that. So I don't know if you've worked with clients like that or if what kind of advice or support would someone in that kind of situation need?
Yeah, I don't have like a magic answer or anything that's like, okay, here's the
Okay.
thing that you're supposed to do. I
Yeah.
think the most important thing is just what you're saying, which is recognize that this is another layer of the shame and the guilt and the grief that is added on for folks in which, family is really considered to be the most important relationships, and you are supposed to tolerate them no matter how abusive or dysfunctional they are. And again, I mean, it's really a tough situation, but I think what
Yeah.
we're talking about is people really looking at, is that working for me? Is that okay with me? And that maybe that if you do decide that you're going to distance yourself or cut ties with some of your family, that doesn't mean you are completely rejecting your culture. I think again it might be a looking at this and saying, okay, what parts of my culture are meaningful to me, work for me, are aligned with my values, and that this doesn't have to be an all or nothing, that I'm not, completely saying, okay, I disagree with everything and my culture's horrible and oppressive or my parents are horrible and oppressive, but that's not necessarily what we're saying or what we believe, that it's more nuanced than that, I think is what we're talking about. And again, trying to tease out for yourself which parts you're going to hold on to and that are meaningful to you and that you're
Yeah.
going to pass down to your children as well.
Gosh,
I
you
think,
said
right.
you didn't have a good answer, but I thought that was a
Well,
fabulous
I mean,
answer.
maybe
That
it's a
was
good
such a
answer.
good answer.
Maybe it's a good answer. It's not an easy fix, is
No,
maybe
it's
what I want to
not.
say. But I
Right.
really think like this really thinking about the generational aspects of it can
Yes.
be helpful here is thinking about, what part of my culture do I want to pass down to my kids? And it's not, some of the things that were harmful to me that my parents or grandparents did to me.
Right.
Right. And again, there's a lot more to culture than
Yes. Thank you for answering that tough question because I do think that
that.
it's a tough thing that a lot of folks encounter. So you've gotten to the point now, someone listening where they're thinking, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to embrace what I can and find the connections I can. Now the grief process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I find is a lot of people would like to skip over the grief process.
That's why it's at the end of the episode. I'm just kidding.
Right. So fast forward to the end.
Listen to the end.
Right, right. I mean, it's hard work. I mean,
Yeah.
grieving is hard no matter what it is that we're grieving. But I
Right.
think the other thing is we don't necessarily recognize all of the different things that we're grieving. And grief is really about a loss. So we're recognizing what has been lost. And some
Right.
of this is, some of it's straightforward, right? The literal, seeing my parents or the relationship with my parents is no longer. But there's also a lot of intangible losses that come along with this. And I talk about some of this in the book in terms of it could be things like pieces of your culture or your family history, even being able to go back to your childhood home. These are things or other relationships that we talked about as well. So there's a lot of different things that are lost that need to be grieved. The other piece is grieving what you were hoping for, what you were longing for that has never existed. But when you have ended the relationship, it is also the acknowledgement, or it needs to be the acknowledgement that now those things, there's no hope for those things.
Yeah.
I am going to acknowledge that having this happier or healthier relationship with my parents that I have, sort of maybe been holding on to that fantasy, that hope that maybe, just maybe things could be better. And now I really have to say to myself, okay, that's not going to happen. I'm not having a relationship with them. So I'm obviously not going to have, that fantasy, healthy, loving, nurturing relationship that I have always wanted. So there's a lot of pieces, there's a lot of sort of levels of the grief work that we're going to do. And so
Yeah.
the first part of it is acknowledging what it is we're grieving. And this doesn't have to happen all at once, right? Certainly, this could be incremental, but start with some piece that you can name, that you can identify. This is what I am grieving. This is what I feel a loss about, and from there we can validate that and say to ourselves that this is real. This loss is real. It's meaningful. It's something that matters to me. And again, that can be tough because a lot of people looking in don't see the loss. Sometimes they don't know that you've cut ties with the family member, or there's no way for them to see, that you're grieving the loss of your grandmother's Christmas cookie recipe, right? Because there's not a tangible thing, that's
It's a
not
good point.
there, right? And we don't have any grieving rituals for the most part around family estrangement. So
That's
there's no
true.
ceremony, there's no public, marker that's saying, Amelia has lost something that's important to her, right? So we tend to have a lot of
Gosh,
those
that's such a good point.
when there's a death that has
Yeah.
happened. And so again, we don't tend to get the care, the compassion, the
Right.
acknowledgement from other people. So we have to do it for ourselves.
I
So that's
also,
yeah.
do you also notice anyone feeling kind of like, I don't want to say embarrassment, but I guess a shame around the need to grieve someone that they feel like was so unhealthy and toxic for them? I think of like someone who leaves an abuser and they still feel like they love or have love for the abuser, and it's confusing and it can feel like this contradicts. I'm a strong woman and I want to go out into the world and be my own woman. How can I still be missing this person who treated me horribly?
Thank you for bringing that up because it really is important because I think that also is part of why people tend to not want to do the grief work is because it's confusing. It doesn't make
Yeah,
sense. And we want to remember that grief is more than sadness. It's not necessarily at all. You might miss the person or you might not. But again, it's
right,
much bigger than that. It's bigger than even just the relationship that we're grieving. But the fact is, it's a loss, even if it's the loss that you are choosing, and even
right,
if it's the loss of something that was hurting you, it's still a change. It's something that is now, missing from your life or not possible to have in your life. So again, if we sort of maybe rethink what it means to be grieving, it can help us a little bit, I think, as well. But again, it's grief is often this confusing mix of emotions that can be, anger and sadness and guilt or confusion or numbness. I mean, all kinds of things are typical feelings that people have when they're grieving, and that can be from one moment to the next, from one day to the next, or all at the same time. You can have all kinds of feelings, at the same time. So, yeah, I think even just remembering that grief doesn't mean crying and sadness. It can,
right.
but not necessarily.
I love the idea of giving grief the space too, because when we do, we're less likely to stay stuck. I think if we try to avoid grief and that process, the stuckness is so chronic. Whereas if we acknowledge the grief and just really allow it to be whatever it needs to be, there's just so much more movement. So, well, Dr. Sharon Martin, I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I know I hit you up with some surprise questions, but for anyone listening who would love to get further support and ideas from you on how to take these next steps, or maybe even how to support someone else they know going through this, can you tell them a little bit about your book, your work, where they can find you?
Yeah, the book is called Cutting Ties with Your Parents, and that should be available from most bookstores. So you can find that on Amazon or
And
bookshop.com or
Audible.
wherever. Yes, it's on Audible. Wherever people want to find their books, should be able to find it there. And then my website is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. And I've got lots of articles and lots of free resources on there. If you go on there and on the homepage, you'll see a place where it says get started. And if you go down to, I can't remember where it says family estrangement or something along those lines, it's pretty obvious. And go to that page, you will find at least a place to start with various suggested articles and newsletter and things like that.
Awesome. Well, I am so glad that we connected. We'll have to stay connected. And I hope that everyone found, something in this conversation that helps them kind of move to the next stage or step of wherever they're at in their journey. And if anyone had anything we didn't talk about or questions they wish we had answered, feel free to reach out and we'll try to hit you back with that. But thank you so much and be well, everyone.